Hello Internet, I'm the Disney Brain, and in my journey to maybe one day catch up on the Boom Comics line, I finally managed to read this intriguing little tale known as The Psychopath. A tale I'm still not entirely sure I have a good handle on, because the sheer amount of ideas on display here begs a fair amount of questions. Questions we'll of course dig a little deeper into here, because that's all I really know how to do. And I want to start with the biggest addition in Psycho Green, a character that seems to be divisive among the Psychopath readers. So the story goes that Psycho Green murdered most of the 1969 MMPR team led by Grace Sterling, a character I really should talk about more one of these days. And after surviving however many years post that old-timey battle, he searches for and revives the Psycho Rangers, but specifically programs them to be loyal to family. And of course, this family isn't complete without Astronema, who eventually goes along with them willingly for reasons we'll get into later. The first thing that jumps to mind when I thought about how Psycho Green operates, even separated from his awkwardly jammed in backstory, is that the central idea that defines him doesn't really need to exist. Green, or Trek if you prefer, essentially serves as the middleman that allows Karone the chance to embrace her past again by way of the 5 anti-Ranger super soldiers she created. But I don't know, it feels tenuous here, when the story itself makes it nakedly clear that in spite of what she says, Karone is still very much struggling with what her past means to her. Because more or less all of his dialogue boils down to unearthing the real Astronema buried beneath the surface, and because of that, he ends up as this overt depiction of Karone's struggles, as if Green himself was meant to serve as the past she tried to leave behind. But that's odd to me on 2 counts. For one, Karone, by way of meditation and who knows what else, has already been trying to cope with her past very recently, and on top of that, Green representing this idea while also having nothing to do with Karone's past comes off as a bit undercooked, especially since his own personal story has very little to do with the demons Karone has and continues to face. So Psycho Green ends up being largely superfluous despite also being the impetus for the plot. And what's more, in my opinion, that struggle would have played out a lot better as a mostly internal one. A struggle where Karone is forced to realize that she created 5 killing machines out of real people, apparently, which would understandably come as a shock, since it's never even remotely implied that the Psychos were created in this way. But if you did think it necessary to frame their history as such, then they aren't just long-standing monsters of the week, or a cog in the Wipeout Dark Spectre plan, because they can't just be that anymore. They are now a brand new sin for Karone to mentally work out, just as soon as she thought she had dealt with them all. But what we actually see with the Psychopath is Karone being granted the same avenue Lost Galaxies Facing the Past gave her. This story, foundationally, is just that episode, but with the Psychos as, well, teenagers with attitudes, instead of some beefy warrior and a battleizer. But the general use of her past as the story driver also gets a bit messy. The writing sort of haphazardly stumbles through what role the identity of Astronema plays in the now, all for the sake of granting Karone a resolution a few pages in that clearly doesn't resolve anything. Which, again, I thought was one of the better ideas here, since even the strongest resolve would be tested upon seeing your most infamous creations barreling through your hometown. Karone feeling obliged to deal with that personally is a good trajectory for her character. A character that, of course, understands firsthand how brainwashing and manipulation ruined her formative years too. To evoke Zordon's famous words once more, I really like the fact that the Psychos are basically teenagers with attitudes, and specifically ones that mostly act even younger by design, because that, at least on paper, carries more weight. Astronema didn't just steal their lives, she stole their chance to grow up, to find themselves, and now she has the chance to right that wrong as a sort of maternal figure? As you might expect, the execution gets a bit dicey, because once Karone is captured, the story begins to treat Astronema more like a super form than a phase of life she's struggling with, which, what even? That's quickly thrown away, but even beyond that, the framing of her being one of Astronema feels at odds with the actual story being told. The story being her need to actively train the Psychos to reject their pasts, not embrace them, to the point where they even come up with new names, not in addition to, but at the expense of their old identities. The clear disconnect there is not something the story wishes to address, despite the fact that the Psychos remember everything, even how many times they've died, so the story absolutely could have. So now let's talk about how jarring it is that Karone has become a willing yet unwilling mother to these disgruntled youths. Just framed as a means of overcoming a crushing amount of guilt that you now have the opportunity to atone for, it kind of fits. But it's one of several aspects of this story that, despite being a hair over 100 pages, feels way too short. And you get to thinking that if the story were twice as long by some miracle, then Karone would realize that accepting herself while trying to carve out a path for her younglings is exactly what her not-father did. One thing a story like this absolutely could have done, as long as we're talking about atoning for sins, is finally giving Karone any sort of post-Astronema closure for her dead caretaker. Hell, that alone could have sufficed as her entire motivating force behind saving the Psychos. It's kind of morbidly funny how perfectly fitting Ecliptor's exact influence would be to this exact tale, and even now, he's just forgotten. But getting back to just the Psychos themselves, it's also really weird how Psycho Pink is clearly framed as just the sweetest little dumpling that Mother Dearest tries her hardest to protect. This goes back to my issues with how misaligned Karone's philosophies are with what she wants to see out of the Psychos themselves. Psycho Pink being saved from dying is one of the clearest examples of why that doesn't work to me, because it's at this point where a more honestly, or at least consistently, written Karone would tell her favorite child to come to terms with the fact that she is a Psycho Ranger. As such, she is responsible for Kendrix's death, among many other crimes, and Karone, being the replacement for Kendrix, is perfectly positioned to explain the negative impact of that event on her Ranger family. You know, that concept these Psychos run on now. And then, she'd get it. She'd understand why Karone didn't feel justified in killing her and bringing her back via data card. She'd understand that life has inherent value, a value she could never see before. But since Karone isn't interested in who the Psychos were as a means of pushing them towards who they can be, it comes off as disjointed and dishonest, especially when you realize her hardline stance against killing somehow doesn't apply to Red's desire for planetary conquest. That's really just a conversation they have, like, what are you doing killing everyone, Psycho Red? That's no way to rule the galaxy. You gotta subjugate people. Trust me, I would know. So, unless we're meant to believe that Karone is lying about how she sorted through her past, we know that her guidance isn't quite aligned with everything she came to believe about herself. And we know she's not lying, because she clearly and consistently asserts herself as to blame for what she did to the Psychos. We also have no real reason to assume that her inconsistencies are intended to represent her struggle with duality, because nothing about the story progression suggests that. Even her overly adamant side, sometimes at the expense of really listening, is something we've seen before in Lost Galaxy, after she faced her past. Literally the next episode, in fact. Speaking of the at times overly adamant Karone, let's dig into the big emotional focal point near the end. Andros is barking at his sister for being nigh impossible to find, while Karone holds fast to her need to guide the Psychos. Andros' role in this is something I thought had a subtle charm to it, because, in theory, his experiences mean he can empathize with Karone's position here, especially after she explains it all, and for a moment, he does. But him being so tied up emotionally to his sister's tragedy that he's unable to hold onto that position for very long, that feels fitting. I can easily believe Andros, the emotionally scarred loner that he is, not being able to make that connection by design, and he's not completely in the wrong here, until he seems set to die on the hill of the Psychos don't deserve names. That's pretty questionable in any context. What I don't quite believe, however, is Karone suddenly flipping the dial by deciding, and then undeciding, that the Psychos should be rebooted. Again. We're supposed to believe that she'd been thinking about this next step for a while now, but the lapses in logic are called out within 5 seconds, and if all this family bonding was solely meant as a means to that end, how are we supposed to read that? Karone's feeling of obligation helped them become better by avoiding morally dubious measures, and it was working, so the struggle she's forcing on them now isn't real. Psycho Pink's plea that they still aren't good enough, despite the last 50 pages disagreeing with her, isn't real. And Karone suddenly switching her stance, which we all knew she would do because why would she suddenly be okay with killing Pink now, isn't real. And this moment represents a crossroad of 5 or 6 solid concepts jammed awkwardly together to form one incredibly amorphous resolution. But it didn't have to be. And this whole time, I kept thinking about how Psycho Green could have been pretty great. He chose to become evil and desires control by planting deluded ideas of family into the Psychos, but by creating incidental conflicts within their programming, he also gives them a way to challenge the loyalty he assumed would follow, kind of like Ecliptor did without a data card. When he realizes his mistake, that's where the real conflict could have been. While Karone learns to be dead set on not using those cards as a shortcut for moral comprehension, as expressed through Psycho Pink's saving, Green, in turn, plans to use them to simplify the Psychos, solidifying his own aspirations. The data card symbolism at play here writes itself, and by destroying them, sans the nonsensical back-end debate, Karone comes to fully realize the idea she originally had kind of sucks, because it would very nakedly involve further manipulating the Psychos and bending them towards her version of moral complexity, and I'm not sure that her stance on that topic would be very reliable at this juncture anyway, because the data cards in this context heavily evoke the controlled state Karone was in when the Psychos first appeared, and fully embracing her past would necessarily mean understanding that she too was making a lot of progress before getting rebooted. Progress made possible because Andros, Ecliptor, and Zane allowed her to think for herself, instead of, seriously considering the same tactics Dark Spectre used, which, incidentally, is another reason that a story about absolving people from forcibly programmed evil really should have had Ecliptor in it. I'm not saying raise the dead, that ship has long sailed, but paraphrasing this scene, that would have been more than enough. This book isn't really written with casual fans in mind anyways, so nobody's gonna miss the reference. All in all, I didn't detest The Psychopath, in spite of my myriad of critiques about, well, almost all of it. The type of story it was going for really speaks to me a lot, honestly, since, as many of you know, some of my favorite experiences with this franchise are stories exactly like this. Stories that allow us to be sympathetic to the plights of the bad guys, because there's simply more to them than being the enemy. That concept, one understood by both seasons the Psychos appear in, is pretty much the foundation for my general love of sci-fi, which is the biggest reason I had so much to say about this particular tale. And also why my disappointment in it really comes down to me not being able to genuinely feel the sympathy they were going for, because the writing only seemed interested in half humanizing the Psychos, and half doesn't really cut it when they're responsible for who knows how many deaths and never come to terms with that. A lot could have been salvaged if Psycho Pink asks with palpable regret and genuine curiosity what Cassie and Kendrix were like as people. But in the absence of anything close to that, trying to buy into her cutesy mama's favorite murderer role was uncomfortable at best. And that's really everywhere here. It's just a bit too cheeky in some spots and too underdeveloped in others to really hit that mark. But it doesn't lack effort or ambition. It doesn't lack a worthwhile story to tell. And divorced from context, there is definitely a slew of panels I really enjoyed and wanted to see more of. At the end of the day, I don't think it was long enough or well structured enough to accomplish all the goals it had in mind, but an attempt was made. It tried, which puts it a little ahead of Beyond the Grid for me, for what that's worth. But anyways, I hope we can get a real conversation going on about this, especially with the people that really got a lot out of this story. And if you like my now 2 stabs at comic reviews, do the whole YouTube analytics thing with the likes and the sharing and the whatnot, and then if there's interest, maybe we'll finally talk about Old Man Tommy, even though I'm much more morbidly curious about this version of Old Man Tommy. But until then, thanks for watching.